Teenagers are chronically online. A recent report by academics at Stellenbosch University has highlighted some insights into the behavioral patterns of both young girls and boys that are online. The study notes that more girls than boys use social media. On average, adolescents spend 3 hours and 17 minutes per day on their phones. To talk more on the study, I'm joined by the head of Cognition and Technology Research, Dr. Daniel Roux. Dr. Roux, thank you so much for your time and for joining us this afternoon. A very alarming statistic that's coming out from that study. Let's first talk about that study. You conducted it with 5 former Model C high schools in collecting that data, and you had a sample of 2,195 adolescents in which they contributed to this. Just talk to us with regards to what the aim of the study is and which outcomes were most alarming to you.
Yes, good afternoon, Katlego, and thank you for your time. It's a pleasure to be with you. The study originated because there's this rise in smartphone ownership among adolescents over the last decade. So in our study, we found that almost all adolescents now own a smartphone in this socioeconomic category. And one of the things that's really important to understand here is these adolescents also take their phones to school with them. And what emerges as a result of this is a real challenge for schools to develop policy that regulates smartphone use in the school environment. Most teachers that we surveyed as part of this project agree that just leaving adolescents to self-regulate their smartphone use in school is not an effective way of going about things. So they agree that there's some sort of top-down regulation in schools required. And then in addition to that, we collected data about smartphones use among adolescents outside of the school area itself, so in their general life.
And I mean, it's very interesting because sometimes you'll find parents who say, I would rather not have my adolescent be in possession of a smartphone. How do parents strike that balance, especially in a time where constant communication is needed between parents and children and even between teachers and students?
Yes, this is really tricky for parents. Our data shows that about 40% of parents have some sort of proactive regulation strategy where they either limit the screen time that their child may have on their smartphone per day, or they monitor it using an application. But 60% of parents do not, and they leave it to children to regulate their own smartphone use. It's also difficult for parents because children often argue that they need these phones to be able to do their academic work. But our data clearly shows that when children are busy doing their academic work, and they might well be using their phones as part thereof, they are also multitasking with non-academic themes. So they might be watching a YouTube video, reading an incoming WhatsApp message, constantly shifting their attention between their academic work and their phones. So these phones have really become integrated into their life worlds. And parents and teachers, rightly so, are to a degree concerned about the long-term impact that this might have on their cognitive development and their academic performance.
Speaking of that, Doc, I mean, how do you believe this increased social media usage, particularly among young girls, affects their mental health and their well-being? Are there specific concerns that arise from the data that you collected?
Yes, so I think for a start, one should be careful to just vilify the medium. So I believe that if social media is used in a healthy way and fits into a teen's ability to find their way and find their identity within a social grouping and to express themselves creatively, of course, this can be really beneficial to them. However, there are certain patterns of smartphone use, and particularly social media use, that are associated with negative well-being outcomes. Among teenage girls in particular, one that many people are concerned about is this idea of upwards social comparison. And what it basically means is quite often these girls would be scrolling through Instagram profiles of influencers or others that really curate their body image or their habits and really present a lifestyle or an image of themselves that's not realistic. And when teens start comparing themselves to what they see, we refer to this as upward social comparison. And every time this comparison happens, they feel like they don't quite meet up to society's expectations. And creates a low self-esteem over time and might lead to negative well-being outcomes like depression, anxiety, and these sorts of things.
So just staying on those impacts, what implications do you think might arise from this high usage of social media? What impact does it have on the cognitive development amongst these young girls compared to their male counterparts? I mean, you speak of that upward social comparison. Does this lead to or have any link to social ills?
I think the important thing to understand from a cognitive perspective is that academic performance, your ability to do well in school and in university and perform well, is tied to your emotional and psychological well-being. It's really difficult for adolescents to perform optimally if they are not psychologically in a good place. So any effect that leads from social media that is negative towards their psychological well-being will also result in a negative impact on their academic performance. With boys, we see a different pattern. Boys might also use social media, maybe not as much as girls do. Our data suggests it's certainly lower. And also, we don't really see this a negative relationship with well-being and social media use that we see with girls. However, with boys, one of the things that we are concerned about is something called time displacement, and particularly when time is displaced as a result of computer or console gaming. So a lot of boys spend a lot of time on these games, particularly in the age categories around 14, 15, and 16 years old. And because they get pulled into these games and they have difficulty stopping their play, they really get involved with these games. A lot of time is spent on it, and that time is obviously taken away from academic or sports or social activities, which might serve their well-being better in the long run. So it's not necessarily that the games themselves are that bad, but it's more a matter of time that can be spent on something else now just drains into hours and hours in front of computers or consoles.
Doc, taking it back to the usage of smartphones, especially within the schooling environment, your study found that there's tools such as ChatGPT in which many of these young students are using for essays, as well as some of the artworks and some of the school projects. Are we going to see an increase in the use of such AI in young people, not creatively coming together and putting essays in the way that we used to back in the day?
Yes, absolutely. I think everybody knows that this trend will increase once learners understand how good these LLMs are in producing, for example, creative text or orals. The pattern of using it for these purposes will spread like a wildfire. So I can almost imagine that the data we collected last year is already outdated. Those patterns have probably already shifted, and more kids are using these things. Now, the big question is, does the use of these things in the long run potentially harm cognitive development? And I think the thing that we need to drill into there is that this process that I went through at school of sitting and having to write an oral, which is quite often a painful process, having to integrate a lot of information. These processes all form part of our cognitive development. And our concern is that some of these processes might now be removed when kids just get the essay written for them by the computer. And we are not sure how the removal of these cognitive processes will influence their cognitive development in the long run. It is important, however, to understand that the world is shifting in this regard. So having kids that are able to utilize AI tools as part of their work is a great advantage. We're all going to be working with these tools in our careers one day. So kids should learn to work with these machines and with these tools. However, we should be mindful of the effect of this on their cognitive development. And at this stage, the jury is still out. We don't yet have good data on how it's going to play out in the long run.
And do you think schools are catching up with the usage of these AI tools? Should they be incorporating them within the school curriculum in order to strike that balance and be able to regulate in terms of how young people are using them, especially in relation to their schoolwork?
It is definitely starting to become a bigger concern among teachers. And in our investigations, we found that some schools have come up with creative strategies to counter this. For example, at one of the schools, the teachers in the languages class force their students to hand in their smartphones at the start of class. So the smartphone has to be placed in a cubby in the front of class. And during that class, when they're asked to do creative writing tasks, they are forced then to come up and think creatively about these things. And I think this is an example of a great strategy in which, while we can harness the phone at some points in the learning process, we should also at some points isolate the learners from their phones and force them to rely more on their intellectual ability in the assignments.
Which certainly does that not make the teachers very popular with the students. So, Doc, how does your research address issues such as cyberbullying and online harassment, particularly in the context of girls using social media?
Yes, so cyberbullying is an emerging problem among girls. It's a complex phenomenon which takes various forms. Among girls, we often see patterns of what we might think of as relational bullying. So this is not the aggression that we might see amongst boys, things like name calling or physical harassment, but it would be more subtle things like, for example, the spreading of rumors or the sharing of secrets or sharing a photo where one of the persons in the photo is in an embarrassing sort of position, right? And these sorts of bullying are obviously well suited to cyberspace, to social media. And while very frequently these types of bullying occur outside of the school environment, it quite often bleeds back into the school environment and the school having to deal with these problems. There is, of course, as with traditional bullying, there is a negative relationship with being exposed to experiences of cyberbullying and what psychological well-being. And this also feeds into academic performance. So academic performance is also negatively correlated with experiences of cyberbullying. So of course, this is something we need to be aware of and we need to study and understand better.
All right, Doc, thank you so much for your time this afternoon. Certainly a very interesting topic, not only for those teenagers and the students, but most importantly for parents and teachers who are monitoring this growing concern. Thank you so much for your time. That was Dr. Daniel Roux, who is the head of Cognition and Technology Research at the Stellenbosch University.